What moment made you lose respect for someone forever?
I worked with a friend, with whom we met back in university in the first year. We prepared for exams together, cheated, looked for part-time jobs, and basically went through a lot together. When we finished studying, we were lucky to get jobs in the same company. It was like a continuation of our friendship. Only now, in adult life, we sat next to each other, went to lunch together, shared plans, and joked that someday we would open something of our own. He often said that he hated mean people who set others up for their own benefit. I never doubted him. When a promotion vacancy opened, we both applied. I didn't see it as competition, because I was sure everything between us was fair. We even discussed it in the evening over beer and laughed that whoever wins buys. A few days later I was called to the manager. The conversation immediately went strangely. He started saying that I create tension in the team and might leak information. I really didn't understand what he meant. Then he opened his laptop and showed screenshots. They were my messages, but they were taken out of context and looked like I was deliberately setting someone up. I immediately understood who did it, because those conversations were only between us. When I left the office, he was sitting at the desk typing something. I walked up and just stood in front of him. He looked up for literally a second and then lowered his eyes again. I asked directly, "Was it you?" He was silent for a few seconds, then quietly said, "It's just work, nothing personal, no apology, no explanation, just fact." At that moment, something inside me seemed to switch off. There wasn't even anger, just emptiness. He got the promotion. Everyone congratulated him. And I sat and watched people shake his hand. A few days later, I wrote a resignation letter. He didn't even come to say goodbye. And I realized that sometimes people don't change. You just start to see them as they really are.
I met a guy in a cafe when I was sitting there after classes just scrolling my phone. He came up himself, very confidently started the conversation, and somehow easily drew me into dialogue. We talked for almost an hour. He seemed open, attentive, and very warm in communication. After that we started texting, and then dating. At first everything was perfect. He wrote first, asked about my day, remembered little things, and made small surprises. It looked natural, not forced. I started to get used to him. After a few months something changed. He didn't suddenly become cold, but a distance appeared. He started saying more often that he was busy, wrote less, sometimes disappeared for a few hours. I blamed it on work and didn't want to overthink. One day I got sick and stayed home. He wrote that he couldn't come because he had things to do. I felt a bit sad but decided not to show it. Then I suddenly thought I wanted to do something nice and drop by with coffee, without warning. Just a surprise. When I arrived, another girl opened the door. She looked confused, as if she didn't understand what was happening. He came out behind her. His reaction was strange, not panic, not fear, just a tired expression. He looked at me and said, "I didn't think you would come." That's it. No sorry, no explanation. I stood there with coffee in my hands, not knowing what to say. The worst part was that it didn't look like an accident. It was too calm, as if it was part of his life. I left the bags at the door and just walked away. He didn't even come after me, and that was what hurt me the most.
I always respected my father. He was strict, sometimes even harsh. But I thought it was part of his character. He constantly talked about principles, honesty and responsibility. He said that a man should take responsibility for his actions and not shift the blame onto others. I grew up with these words in my head. I really tried to be like him. One evening I came home earlier than usual. The apartment was quiet, but I heard him talking on the phone in another room. I wasn't eavesdropping on purpose. I was just passing by and heard familiar words. He was discussing some situation at work. At first it sounded ordinary, but then his tone changed. He started talking about how to carefully get out of the problem and shift responsibility onto another employee. He even said a name. It was a new guy who had just recently joined. The strangest thing was how he said it, calmly, confidently, even with a slight laugh, as if it wasn't something bad, but just a work moment. He said that the guy won't prove anything, and that it would be easier this way. I stood still. I couldn't believe it was him saying this. Then he finished the conversation and came into my room. He didn't even suspect that I'd heard everything. He sat next to me and started talking about how important it is to be honest in life. I looked at him and couldn't listen. The words sounded empty. At that moment, I saw for the first time the gap between what he said and what he did. And after that, I could no longer look at him the same way.
I lived with a guy for almost a year and a half. We met through mutual friends at a birthday party, and everything quickly developed. After a few months, I had already moved my things to his place. We shared household chores, expenses, planned trips, and even talked about the future. It didn't look like something temporary. I felt that it was serious. He never gave clear reasons to doubt. Yes, sometimes he was colder, sometimes lost in his phone. But it seemed like small things. I didn't check on him, didn't invade his personal space. I just trusted. One evening I came home earlier. He had texted that he would be late at work. I even bought food to make us dinner. When I entered the apartment, it was quiet, but not as usual. The light was on. I walked further and heard voices. The bedroom door was slightly open. I opened it and froze. He wasn't alone. They both looked at me. And in that moment, time seemed to stop. No one said anything right away. I waited for some reaction, explanation, shock, panic. But he just sat down and ran his hand over his face, as if I was disturbing him. He didn't even look guilty, more irritated. I stood for a few seconds, then just turned around and left. I didn't scream, didn't cry there. I just left the apartment where I had lived an hour earlier. He texted me an hour later. "Not sorry," he wrote. "We complicated everything." And then I realized that for him it wasn't even a mistake. It was just an option.
I stopped communicating with my parents at 19, and it wasn't an impulsive decision. It had been building up for years. From the outside, we looked like a normal family. No one drank in the family, and I wasn't beaten. There weren't daily scandals. But there was something else, a complete lack of respect. My father always said that I didn't try hard enough. Whatever I did, it was never enough. If I brought good grades, he said it wasn't ideal. If I stayed quiet, he said I was weak. If I proved something, he said I was arrogant. My mother never took my side. She just stayed silent. And that silence sometimes hit harder than his words. When I got into university, which I had earned and prepared for myself, I was truly proud of myself. I came home and told them. My father didn't even look at me properly. He just said, "We'll see how long you last there." That was the first time I felt not hurt, but something else, as if something had finally broken. A few weeks later, we had another conversation that quickly turned into conflict. He again started saying that I would achieve nothing, and at some point, I just stopped listening. I went to my room, packed my things and left. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. My mother stood in the hallway and just looked, silently as always. I closed the door and realized that it was the end. Several years have passed since that day. They sometimes write to me, but I don't feel anything anymore, not even anger.
I worked in a company where the manager seemed very adequate and fair. He often talked about the team, support and development. I believed him because he knew how to present it convincingly. I invested a lot in my work, took on extra tasks, stayed longer, helped others. It wasn't out of fear. I really wanted to grow. After some time he started paying more attention to me, called me for talks more often, asked about plans, even praised me. I thought it was a normal process before a promotion. One evening he wrote that we needed to discuss something important outside the office. It seemed strange to me, but I agreed. We met in a cafe. At first everything was normal. Then the conversation changed. He started speaking in hints that in the company, it's important to be closer to management, that there are people who understand the rules of the game. I immediately understood what he meant. I said that I wasn't interested in that format. After that, everything changed very quickly. At work, he became cold, started picking on small things, criticizing, ignoring my ideas. A month later, I was told that I didn't fit the team. I walked out of the office remembering all his words about honesty and values. And they sounded like a bad joke. A week later, I quit.
I lived with a girl for almost 2 years. We shared everything from daily life to future plans. It looked stable. I didn't doubt her. I was going through a difficult period at work. I was losing projects, had money problems. I became more withdrawn. But she knew what I was going through. I thought she was by my side. At some point, I started noticing that she was distancing herself, fewer conversations, less attention. But I blamed it on my own state. One day I came home earlier. The apartment was quiet, but it felt like someone was there. I went into the bedroom and saw her with another guy. Everything was very quick and very clear. They both looked at me. She didn't even look surprised, more tense, as if it was only a matter of time before this happened. I waited for some explanation, but she said, "You distanced yourself." It sounded like an accusation, as if I'd caused this. I stood there realizing that she had already made her decision long ago, just hadn't said it. And in that moment, I understood that sometimes people leave even before you notice it.
I always trusted my mom. She was the person I turned to in difficult moments. We could talk for hours, and I wasn't afraid to open up. When I started a serious relationship, I also shared it with her, told her details, worries, even doubts. She listened and gave advice. After some time, I began to notice that my boyfriend reacted strangely to certain things. He knew things I hadn't told him. At first, I didn't understand where it came from. Then, accidentally in conversation, he said a phrase that I had definitely only told my mom. I felt something tighten inside. I asked him directly. At first, he avoided answering, but then said he had been talking to her. It turned out they were texting. She wrote to him herself, to understand him better. And she told him things about me. When I asked her, she said she wanted the best, but I realized she had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. And after that, I could no longer talk to her the way I used to.
We were friends for several years. It wasn't a superficial friendship. We really trusted each other. I shared with him things I didn't tell everyone. One day I told him about an idea for a small online project. Just as a thought, I wanted to hear his perspective. He got interested, asked a lot of questions, even said it could take off. I didn't start anything then. I postponed it because of work and lack of time. A few weeks later, I accidentally came across his page and saw the implementation of that idea. Almost identical. The same concept, the same details. I wrote to him directly, not aggressively. Just asked if it wasn't what we had talked about. He replied calmly, "Well, yes. But you weren't doing anything. I just decided not to waste time." The worst part wasn't even that, but that he genuinely didn't understand what the problem was. At that moment, I realized that for him, friendship wasn't about respect or boundaries. It was about benefit. After that, we still communicated, but only formally. Inside me, something important just switched off: respect.
We dated for almost a year, and honestly, it was one of the calmest relationships in my life. He always knew what to say, was always attentive. remembered little things, could show up with coffee just because I had a bad day. I got used to thinking I was lucky. Then I got sick. Nothing super serious, but I could barely get out of bed. I texted him simply, "I feel really bad today." I expected at least some warmth in response, not necessarily to come over. "Just support," he replied. "I'm with the guys today. Let's talk tomorrow." I didn't immediately realize what hurt me. It wasn't rudeness. It was indifference. In the evening, I opened social media and saw him laughing, hanging out, drinking, posting stories, and then it hit me. He was there only when it was convenient. For some time, I tried not to make it a problem. But after that moment, I started noticing other things. How he avoided difficult topics. How he didn't want to take responsibility. How easily he chose himself. And one day, I simply realized I no longer respected him. And without respect, even perfect relationships are worth nothing.
From the outside, everything seemed normal. We were together, talked, met with friends. But there was one thing I ignored for a long time. She constantly teased me. At first it was small things. "Well, you as always. You know you're not the most organized. I would do better in your place." I took it normally. Even thought she was just being honest. But over time it became a system. She started joking about me in front of others, about my work, my decisions, my plans, and I noticed I was starting to doubt myself. Before saying something, I thought whether I would look silly. Before doing something, I thought whether she would devalue it. The culmination was at one evening. We were sitting with friends. I was talking about an idea I was working on, and she interrupted. "He's always coming up with something, but rarely finishes. Don't take him seriously." Everyone laughed. But for the first time I couldn't. I sat there thinking, this wasn't a joke. It was her real attitude. And in that moment I looked at her completely differently. I realized, a person who respects you doesn't destroy you in front of others. And in that moment the respect disappeared completely.
I was going through a very difficult period, breakup, emotional state, constant self-doubts, and she was there. My best friend. She listened to me for hours, comforted me, said I deserved better. But everything would be fine. I truly felt that without her, it would have been much harder. Then one day a girl I didn't even know wrote to me. She asked, "Do you know that your friend is talking to your tutor ex?" At first, I thought it was some mistake, but she sent me their messages. It showed how my friend discussed my problems, but with him, shared details, laughed, even flirted. I sat there unable to believe it. The person I trusted the most turned out to be the one leaking everything to the other side. When I asked her, she said, "I just didn't want to lose contact with him. And anyway, you had already broken up." That you had already broken up was the moment when something inside me just shut down. Because it wasn't about him. It was about the fact that she didn't see anything wrong in it.